Narendra Taneja, India's leading energy expert. Narendra, in a week in which we have the Chinese and the Americans meeting in London, we have everybody boarding a plane to fly to Canada for the G7 summit. What are your thoughts on these events, and which has the sort of the biggest outlook and impact for the oil markets?
Well, good question. I think the optics are interesting and sound positive, but I think we have to go beyond optic. And I really don't think there is any fundamental change in terms of economic relationships or economic tension between the United States and China. I think picture is more or less the same. US is going to stick to what the way they have been since President Trump moved into the White House, and China is working on a long-term agenda. They want to be number one power on the planet, number one economic power, political power, military power, and so on and so forth. But they are very good at playing these games. China is a great chess player, and I think they know how to outsmart President Trump if they need to, and this is precisely what they are doing. G7 again, I mean, according to me, is a misnomer. Indian Prime Minister is going there, and will be there on the high level. But at the same time, G7 means the large economy of the world, but India is the fourth
Just
largest
take
economy in the
one
world.
point, sorry, on the Indian Prime Minister going. I mean, relations with Canada in particular haven't been great between India and China. Is this any indicator of them moving now in a more positive direction?
Well, I mean, there was stress in relations between India and Prime Minister Trudeau, not with Canada.
Okay.
Now that there is a new leadership, and the leadership is taking a completely different view, there never been any major problem between the two countries. It has been with the leadership, the then leadership of Prime Minister Trudeau. And I think that now that he's out of the Prime Minister office, things have begun to fall, kind of to where they should be, because Canada is a very important country, important business partner for India. There are millions of Indians living there and all that, and contributing to Canada's economy and political life too. So I think no. But coming to G7, I mean, G7 basically means the seven largest economy of the world. But India is the fourth largest economy on the planet, and they are not part of the G7. So, I mean, the whole construct of G7 basically is G7 the West or G7 the OECD. I mean, should we take it that seriously? People like me, we don't. Yes, but it's good to be there, and a prime minister will be there in times like these when there is so much of massive economic and geopolitical turbulence. It's important that India is there participating in all important events, including G7.
We're kind of in this, we're looking at these events happening, these meetings, the G7, and although it's as you say, G7 is a bit outdated. It's no longer representative of what it once was, but that's why they invite India and they invite all of the other actors in the world to attend. Saudi Arabia Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is going, and it's more G20 than G7 in reality, but it's still called the G7. Can it be a vehicle in which to calm down some of these greater tensions around trade? Because ultimately, there doesn't seem to be much bilateral trade negotiations going on, even though we're close to the end of the 90-day suspension of the reciprocal tariffs that came on April 2nd and sent the world into a nosedive. That suspended period is coming to an end. And the only ones we seem to be having talks, at least publicly, is China, US. The rest of the world, at least we're not seeing or hearing about progress in their trade talks. Can the G7 slash G everybody be a platform where this thing gets sorted out in any way? Or is that too much expectation?
I think it's too much expectation. If you look at the different leaders who are going to participate in G7 in Canada, I think probably the focus is more on bilaterals that are being set up. For instance, between Indian Prime Minister and the US President, Indian Prime Minister, and the new Canadian, a Prime Minister, India's head of India's Prime Minister with the Chinese leadership, and so on and so forth. I think, G7, because G20 has become more powerful now and actually a far more relevant and important organization because it represents 80% of the world economy. G7 doesn't. I mean, look at the G7. If we look upon G7 more like a kind of Western construct, and even if you look at the ground reality in the West, is fragmented. Europe is drifting away, and the US is kind of gone, it got its own direction. We don't know where exactly it's going
Yeah,
to
but
end.
ultimately it's a chance to meet. I mean, whatever it's called it chip and chips. It's just a chance for the world's leaders to meet, and with that meeting, resolve some of these fairly big issues that have were announced to the world in April and have kind of gone silent, but yet are still there. I mean, that's the period of suspension ends in a few weeks.
I appreciate your optimism, but the point is, what is G7 agenda? What do they want to achieve? Have they shared that with the world? We have seen, of course, the agenda, but that's actually, if you look at very carefully, I mean, it's probably the more meat is going to come out of bilaterals and not, through that multilateral meat. That is the point, because where exactly
So, can the Indian bilateral with America, with Trump and Modi, resolve the outstanding trade position that India has, that the US is demanding more access? I think India's signaled they might give American goods zero tariff.
Well, it's going to be very high on the agenda for sure. It's very difficult to negotiate with President Trump, even if you perceive yourself as being a close friend of President Trump. We all know by now that even, that is very, very difficult. We just saw the Elon Musk episode. But the point here is that, the question is, when you look at the fundamentals are the world as we have seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union now, and the America leading the world, that era is gone, and the new world is emerging. And in the new world, is not going to happen tomorrow morning. It may take 15, 20 years. But in the new world order, the poles are going to be Washington, D.C., Brussels, Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi. That's the reality. So along the way, we are going to see a lot of disruption, a lot of summit, a lot of new
What about
construction.
Dublin? Dublin's not going to be on the list. Jeez, I mean,
Ah,
come on.
Dublin will have to go via Brussels. So Brussels is going to be very, very important. Europe is going to emerge as the second most powerful entity. I think probably bigger than China. The way things in 5 years, United Europe will be more powerful than China, which is a good news as far as India is concerned. Yeah, is good. A militarily powerful Europe, economically more autonomous Europe is good news for the world. Certainly very good news for India. So that's how we are looking at it. So in along the way, the next 15, 20 years, you will see the emergence of several new constructs like G7. G20 is already there, but you will see more like, in the Asia Pacific part of the world. You might see in Africa, you might see Europe together with Latin America and so on and so forth. So this circus will go on. But the
And
reality
this
is the
will be
world
the turbulence. This turbulence reflects,
massive
and it's going
disruption
to
and massive
continue.
turbulence. And that will also reflect in oil prices. Have you noticed one thing since President Trump visited Saudi Arabia and the United and Qatar and all the Gulf region, oil prices have seen new kind of direction. I see something has happened that suddenly we see that America and the Gulf, oil powers, they're more or less talking the same way. They are more or less behaving the same way. You see the influence of that on OPEC and so on and so forth. It seems some kind of, matrix has been worked out, quietly between the United States and the GCC country. I have no evidence, but to us, who are the second largest importer of oil in the world, that seems to be the case.
Narendra, looking at India's particular economic well-being, again, one of the has been the fastest growing big economy in the world in recent years. It sort of stumbled a little bit from its elevated position. It sort of had a little bit of a more sober year. How is it looking now? You're obviously coming into a new fiscal year. In a new fiscal year, what is the outlook for that?
Well, if you look at the data, the latest data of, let's say, the last quarter, there's January to March, and the GDP numbers was 7.4% growth. 7.4. I mean, it surprised many of us, including me. But that's the number. And I think if you look at the economic landscape today, and also, major players like the corporates and demand and different states, because we are a feudal structure, exports and imports and everything, if you put everything into the basket, I think we're probably going to be, this calendar year, we are going to be in the region of maybe about 6.4%. So for an economy of our size, which is 4.2 trillion dollar on nominal basis and $14 trillion on PPP basis, 6.4, 6.5 is very impressive number. And I see absolutely no reason that we'll not be able to achieve it because the monsoon indications are very good. And monsoon has already covered parts of India, the southern part, for instance. And the forecast is monsoon is going to be very, very good. And good monsoon is always means good GDP number. So, and the economic sentiments are very good. And of course, for one couple of weeks, we had a bit of turbulence in terms of, tiff with Pakistan, but that's all over. It's all forgotten as far as economic India is concerned. Things are almost back to normal. So overall sentiments very good, and that's why we don't want to see any turbulence in terms of America and China trade relationship because that's not good for us. And we just hope that President Trump might be firing all the time, but that's more politics, more aimed at his domestic voters than actually the international order. But he's unpredictable. That we know it. Everybody knows it by now. But that said, at the same time, we think that even for instance, things go a bit wrong, global economy by and large should be able to sustain the next 1,000 days or so, whatever number it is. And probably there will not be any fundamental damage to the global economy. So one has to really look at it and think in a most positive way, engage with President Trump to the extent possible. At the same time, a respective country like India, China, Russia, European Union, Japan, we all need to make sure that the world remains on the track, as particularly when it comes to economy. But the last line I want to add here is that as far as oil prices are concerned, the way landscape is emerging and the thaw we have seen between the GCC and the United Saudi Arabia and the United States, and at the same time, whatever is happening between China and the United, we think the oil prices probably are going to be in the region of maybe $62 per barrel to $70 per barrel, at least for the next 2 3 months. Very difficult to predict long term, but it looks like that's the kind of thing which is going to be acceptable to the large importers as well as to the large exporter. And even $70 per barrel Brent is not a bad news for as far as India is concerned.